Wilfred McClay holds the Victor Davis Hanson Chair in Classical History and Western Civilization at Hillsdale College. Before coming to Hillsdale in the fall of 2021, he was the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma and the director of the Center for the History of Liberty. When Rix and my niece Elizabeth was an undergrad at OU, she was trying to start a Turning Point USA chapter on her campus, but she couldn't find a faculty advisor, which is required to sponsor the chapter. But then she met Dr. McClay, and he readily agreed to support the Turning Point chapter, which is now going strong on the OU campus. Dr. McClay is the author of several books, including his most recent, Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. Last fall, we made this book required reading for our Emerging Leaders Council prior to their leadership summit in Washington, D.C. And we have copies of Land of Hope available for sale today out in the foyer, and Dr. McClay will be signing books during the break following his remarks this morning. In May of this year, Dr. McClay was awarded the prestigious Bradley Prize by the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation. And I had the good fortune to attend the prize ceremony in Washington, D.C., and was inspired by his remarks about the need for America to become a serious nation again. It was his remarks that inspired the theme for this weekend's 14th Annual Freedom Conference. Dr. McClay is a member of the U.S. Commission on the Semi-Quincentennial, I had to practice that a few times, which is planning the celebration of our nation's 250th birthday in 2026. Please be sure to submit your questions for Dr. McClay using the QR code provided. And now, let's give a warm Rocky Mountain welcome to Dr. Wilfred.
We're off to a good start here, microphone falling out. But how about Steve? Wouldn't you like to be able to do that? Oh, that's so great. Well, thank you and good morning to everybody. It's hard not to be cheerful in a place like this, a beautiful place like this. We're surrounded by wonderful people, beautiful people, in fact, many of you, all of you. And friends, new and old, men and women who you admire and with whom you share a great many important things. It's wonderful to come together in this way, and you hear a but coming. But I don't want to dampen your enthusiasm or your cheerfulness or your optimism by beginning with a message that's a bit more somber or troubling, but sometimes that's what we have to do. This is one of those times. Loving our country, which is something we all share, I think, doesn't mean glossing over all that's going wrong with it. No, in fact, it means doing the opposite. It means stepping up and telling the truth when we see something beautiful being desecrated and dishonored, and stepping up while there's still time to correct what's wrong and bring us back to virtue, to balance, to sanity. So I'm going to build my brief remarks this morning around actually the speech that Jennifer described and the story that it is built around. I love stories. That's probably why I went into the history business to begin with. You've heard it said by statisticians and dry people like that anecdotes are not data. But I say so much the worse for data. Stories are what make the world go round. Stories are the means by which we orient ourselves to the world and to one another. We're enveloped by stories, by exotic stories of faraway places and heroic things that capture our imaginations and renew our hearts, especially when we're young, but also by stories closer to home, stories of which we're already a part and that are a part of us, stories that have already formed the basis of our common life, even before we lisp the first words coming out of our mouths. Stories drawn from the Bible, from children's literature, from great novels and classic movies, stories from history or humbler sources, such as the shared yarns of extended families and memorabilia of long-standing friendships and intimate relations. It is in the mirror of these stories that we recognize ourselves, who we are. And stories contain much more meaning than a mere statement or a collection of statements. A good story, truthfully told, can carry a load of very different meanings, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and yet hold it all together. We may be a nation built around a proposition, as Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address, but we're also people built around a story. So here's my humble little story for this morning to get us started. At some point in the past couple of years, I was fortunate enough to have dinner with a very wise friend here. Actually, it was in Washington, now that I think about it. It was in Washington at his favorite seafood restaurant, which has since closed, which I think is symbolic in some way. After an hour or so of chit-chat and sort of high-minded gossip catching up, I made a comment, which I thought was maybe a little edgy, but I wanted to get it out. I remarked on the fact that he seemed to be spending more and more time abroad and less time at home, and particularly in a certain foreign country, which will be named in a moment. Most of his time was away. This isn't unusual for academics, and this particular individual is a very distinguished academic who's in demand all over the world. So he acknowledged the facts behind my question, paused for a moment, and then added the following astonishing words. I want to live in a serious country. His tone was one of regret rather than anger. And yet he said it unhesitatingly, as if he'd been prepared for the question. It may be relevant now to point out the foreign country in question is Israel, where seriousness is an existential requirement. But it's equally important to point out that the gentleman in question is an American patriot of the highest order. He's the author of books on the subject. And he is a very serious man. For him to say such a thing was therefore, for me, a very serious matter. That's why I was so astonished that he said it. I didn't ask him to explain or elaborate. I didn't think I needed to or that I should. Instead, I've just pondered what he said in the years since. So, have we become an unserious country? I dismissed the idea at first, with my patriotic reflex, I suppose. But millions of good, respectable, ordinary Americans go about their business, work at their jobs, raise their families, pay their bills, participate in the life of their communities, building their futures and the futures of their children and grandchildren. These are serious people. They don't have time for the inanities that polarize our culture. Too much depends on them. They don't have time for it. But then I thought again about the question, and I considered the evidence. Would a serious country have run up a national debt of now approaching 33 trillion? Depending on how you calculate it, the guy on the newsreel said 33 trillion, Somewhere along the line you have real money. 33 trillion, I like that figure better. During a time of relative peace and prosperity. Would a serious country have done that, have run up that level of debt? Would a serious country have used much of that borrowed money to feather its nest with cheap consumer goods and other markers of material prosperity, goods produced by a ruthless foreign power employing what amounts to slave labor? A ruthless foreign power that our country has done everything in its power over the past 30 years to strengthen and placate and mollify and refuse to see for the deadly rival that it has become. Does a serious country do this kind of thing? Would a serious country have leaders so deeply preoccupied with domestic wrangling and partisan advantage that they fail to see that the rest of the world is watching and taking note, and that the hostile powers of the world are even now calculating the formerly unimaginable possibilities that are opening up to them because of our feckless leadership? Would a serious country actively seek to demoralize and depopulate its urban police forces and acquiesce in some of the greatest cities in our land being turned into hellholes of criminality and disorder? Would a serious country promulgate arbitrary and contradictory policies regarding public health, causing angry divisions in the land and distrust of authority that may take years to heal, if it does heal? Would a serious country show surprisingly little interest in ascertaining the origins of the virus causing the recent pandemic, and insist that the virus's name not include anything referring to the country, China, in which it originated? Wouldn't it instead consider that this debacle has provided us with powerful evidence for the potential usefulness of biological weapons in bringing down an entire society without firing a shot? Would a serious country allow a 20-year investment in Afghanistan to go up in smoke? Would it abandon the Afghans who had trusted in its protection, and I think especially of Afghan women and girls, along with a major air base and 90 billion of weaponry, an amount greater than the military budget of all but 2 countries on planet Earth? Even when such abandonment left matters just as they were 20 years before, but with the additional problem that the jihadist enemy could now take pride and added confidence in the righteousness of their cause from having vanquished and humiliated the greatest military power in the world. Would a serious country allow the apparatus by which it elects its leaders to become so corrupted and fall into such disrepute and disrepair that the citizenry of all political persuasions no longer trust the outcomes of their elections? Would a serious country nominate and confirm to a lifetime appointment on its highest court a jurist who, on questioning, claimed she was unable to define what a woman is? Well, I could go on. And you know that I could. I don't want to ruin your morning completely. I could go on all day just talking about the patent absurdities that the mainstreaming of gender ideology has brought about and introduced into the fabric of our national life. I'll just mention the name Leah Thomas to stand for all of it and point out the extent of the problem. It's ironic, isn't it, that Title IX, which was initially used as a means of ensuring better funding for women's athletics in schools at all levels, is now serving as a means of destroying women's athletics. As this last example implies, and I'm showing great restraint and not providing more examples, but as this last example, the example of the Supreme Court justice implies, being a serious country also entails a capacity to laugh at the things that are laughable. It also means retaining the capacity to find repugnant those things that are repugnant. If we lose those things, we lose that capacity, we're no longer a serious people or a people at all, but have become ciphers, afraid of their own shadows. And let it be noted that every problem, or almost every problem I have described, has been a problem we have brought on ourselves. It's not external force, but internal weakness and irresolution and purposelessness that have been the drivers of our most recent predicaments. But before I leave off with the litany, which is kind of fun, of would a serious country do this? Before I stop that, here is the question that most concerns me and the reason I'm here. Would a serious country so completely lose perspective on its own past that it would entertain the idea that the nation was founded on slavery rather than on the ideals that have made it a beacon to the rest of the world? Would a serious country think it appropriate to teach its children that the nation's past is best understood as a parade of horrors to which the most appropriate response is not pride, but lacerating shame? Sometimes we don't think enough about the effects of the wrong kinds of stories on the health of the souls of our children. A lawyer friend of mine said to me recently that he thought that for children to grow up believing that they lived under a bad regime was damaging in a permanent way to their souls. That really made an impression on me, that statement. I think about it a lot. When I bring up to my fellow historians, have you thought about the effect that your debunking of American ideals has on young people? Their answer is always the same. That's not my department. That's not my job. Somebody else is responsible for that. Well, let me tell you, nobody's doing it. The somebody else is somewhere else, and they aren't doing the job. So we have to think about that. Now, we really have to think about the question of what kind of moral effects arise out of the story that we tell about the American past. So the sultry days of August are just about gone. The new school year is now hard upon us, harder than on some of us than others. And along with the stress of attending to all the last-minute preparations and buying new clothes and fresh supplies, notebooks and pencils, and people still use those instead of just using an iPad for everything. After-school transportation, that's a perennial. Anxious parents are wondering what their kids are going to encounter in their new classes and what their local school boards may be doing about that. What in particular will the children learn about the history and government of their own country? That ought to be a major concern, not only for their parents, but for all of us. After all, one of the chief arguments for universal compulsory schooling has always been that a liberal democracy like ours cannot long survive without a critical mass of properly educated citizens who understand the origins of our constitutional system, know their rights and responsibilities as citizens, respect the rule of law and the fundamental practices that it underwrites. Look around you, not around this room, but around our country. Look around you and ask yourself how well we've been doing in that department, teaching those things. So, can we do better by the next generation of children? I sure hope so. Will they become grounded in a knowledge of the American story, the story of how a nation built on the foundations of religious faith, Republican self-rule, and economic opportunity came into being in the British colonies of North America, established the world's oldest constitution, became the freest and most prosperous land in the world, albeit a very imperfect land that it's had to struggle repeatedly to correct its sins and deficiencies. And yet, a land that opened its arms like no other to the world's exiles and went on to defend the cause of freedom the world over. Is that what they'll encounter? It would be nice if they did, but they might encounter something different. A Howard Zinn-like version of American history that will, with apologies to Johnny Mercer, a name some of you will know, accentuate the negative. Or perhaps worst of all, will they come away with a sense of history as a disorganized hodgepodge of dates, events, names, factoids, textbooks, sidebars, a themeless pudding to quote Churchill. Really, just one damn thing after another. Henry Ford was alleged to have said that one. A formless grab bag whose only order is a shape that someone arbitrarily imposes on it, and usually for some political or weaponized purpose. Will that kind of account of the past, if you could even call it an account of the past, contribute to their sense of the American past as something to which they're connected, as part of their lives, or will it immunize them against ever feeling those things and taking any further interest? These days, there's yet another obstacle, which I think is described by the writer John Dos Passos in a wonderful passage that I use as the epilogue to my book, Land of Hope, that was described in the introduction. Dos Passos called it that idiot delusion of the exceptional now. He would not have been an opponent of American exceptionalism, but he is an opponent of exceptional nowism. That is, that we live in a moment. And the moment he was writing was a different moment than ours, but we live in a moment that has never been like any other moment before. It's hard to get kids interested in the past. You know, anybody who's tried to do that knows what I'm talking about. Even family history, maybe especially family history. Who cares what Grandpa had to do? They had to actually use vinyl LPs to play music. Wow, he had it rough. But it's even harder today because young people are convinced that we're living in such an unprecedented time. And the technologies shaping our world are so transformative. And there's really no point in learning about what went on in the 17th century, good grief, or the 19th, or even the 20th, because they've all been superseded. Just as our present world is already in the process of being superseded. Boomer. While this may be a lazy view of things, and it sure is, but one thing is it is extremely lazy, it also represents an honest conviction, amply reinforced by the endless parade of sensations and images in which we're all enveloped. One thing, not one damn thing, one thing always being succeeded by something else. Nothing being permanent, nothing enduring, always moving into the next exceptional now. If that were the only way you'd ever experience the world, how could you possibly care about the past? How could it matter to you? But this is why we have institutions of formal education, in order to train the mind to skills that the surrounding culture doesn't automatically provide. That's actually putting it mildly, the skills that we desperately need to counteract the culture's corrosive effects, its tendency towards erasure. So fittingly, one of the things that we need to teach is the art of memory, the very thing that a culture of ceaseless change is going to attempt to erase. But this erasure represents a mortal threat to our very humanity and therefore must be resisted. Without memory, our life and our thought dissolve into a meaningless, unrelated rush of events, and we become helpless and easily tyrannized, even if we are technologically advanced. And what is true for the individual, the loss of memory in an individual, is also true for a civilization, for a country to lose its memory. To lose your memory is to lose a sense of who you are. It's true for the individual, it's true for the collectivity as well. Absent a force mounted against them, these incessant waves of daily events will undermine our efforts to connect the past, the present, and the future. They'll obstruct our understanding of the human things that unfold in time, including the path of our own lives. And they'll blind us to the gratitude that we owe to others for all that we have been given, that are not part of the natural state of things, that they're there because others put them there. through great effort, through blood, sweat, and tears. Gratitude is one of the greatest of the civic virtues, but it's impossible. It's impossible without the broad horizons of memory. People have to remember in order to be grateful. They remember you did that for me. I continue to feel grateful to you for it. We have to have that kind of quality of memory. And an excessive absorption in the present will erode our sense of the past, erode our sense of being part of a common American story, a story, may I add, whose glories vastly outweigh its faults, a story studded with moments of moral grandeur at places as different as Normandy, Selma, Lexington, Gettysburg, and Arlington Cemetery. Back to John Dos Passos for a minute. Any of you who acquired Land of Hope, please read the epigraph, the long quotation at the beginning. It's really terrific. You don't even need to read the book. The epigraph says it all. But buy the book. Dos Passos lived at a different time. Some of you probably know his name. Some of you may know his work. He was a very prominent experimental novelist in the early part of the 20th century. He wrote a trilogy called USA that is full of, it's as experimental as James Joyce or Faulkner or any of the other writers of that time, formally experimental. And he was also a man of the left, very much of the left. And the Sacco Vanzetti case was something that really polarized him to the left, to a kind of communist left. Well, I wouldn't be so happy about quoting him if he had stayed there. He had an awakening. He became woke about America. And by the time of the New Deal, by the time of the 1930s and 40s, he was writing from a whole different perspective. This epigraph that I urge you to read after you've bought the book was written in 1941. And this is I don't say this because it's an epigraph, but this is a year, an extraordinary year. I mean, we all think of Pearl Harbor, but this is earlier. This is the whole world was at war. The United States actually was more at war than we knew, but that's another story. But the United States was not formally in the Second World War at that point. But it was a very precarious time. I'll come back to that in a moment. And he offered at this extraordinary moment a defense of history. And not just history as a record of the past, but of historical knowledge, as a treasury of memory, a form of consciousness, a personal possession, a felt connection to the past. And here's what he said. I hope this won't discourage you from buying the book so that you can read the whole epigraph. Am I seeming mercenary? I hope not. I do. Okay. It's a beautiful quote. In easy times, history is more or less of an ornamental art. But in times of danger, we are driven to the written record by a pressing need to find answers to the riddles of today. In times of change and danger, when there's a quicksand of fear under men's reasoning, a sense of continuity with generations gone before can stretch like a lifeline across the scary present. That is why in times like ours, when old institutions are caving in and being replaced by new institutions, not necessarily in accord with most men's preconceived hopes, political thought has to look backwards as well as forwards. I mean, that could be written today without changing a word. Certainly what was true in 1941 is no less true in 2022. It may be more true. History has many uses, and I try to convince undergraduates who I want to major in history. I recite these. Not all of them are attractive to young people. I think one of its chief values, it releases us from the mental prison of the present. by giving us the freedom to wander through time and space, to understand and learn from our past and the past of others, too. Maybe very different from ours. And even more elementally, to savor our rootedness in the things that have come before us. Given the matrix-like hold of our digital technologies, in which things can be disappeared like that, we may need that release more than ever, which means that we need to do a better job of equipping our people with that mental freedom, imparting to them the confident knowledge that we still share a common American story. Land of Hope represented my small attempt to provide an adequate response to these questions about our past. In the 3 years since the book was published, I found out how many of us have needed and wanted such a book. The reception of it has been very surprising and very gratifying to me. And look, it's not a Valentine. Although if it's a complicated Valentine, I don't think you send this complicated a Valentine to your Valentines. Nobody wants, in my opinion, an account of the American past that's sanitized. We know too much about our faults and the importance of owning them. We can't run from them. We can't deny them. But we also want and need an account that places our faults in proper perspective, to understand them in much the same way that we understand every flawed but fundamentally admirable, even lovable person we've ever known and loved in our personal lives. That is the nature of love, not to demand perfection, but to see imperfection in the light of something larger. And the unwillingness to love is, I think, the greatest unseriousness of all. So, we need to become a serious country again. We could get red baseball caps with the initials for that. It'd be rather crowded. And to do that, to become a serious country again, we need to believe in ourselves again. Believe in the reason we've been placed here as what I call a land of hope, for a world that needs hope more than ever. We need to understand that a world without America will be immeasurably diminished, both in material and spiritual terms, and that we have no choice but to live up to the responsibilities that come with our many blessings. Our history can, in my view, be an enormous resource in that endeavor. The work will not be easy, but it will be much harder to live with ourselves and with the rebuke of the future should we shrink from the challenge. And once we understand what's at stake, we may feel a certain exhilaration that comes of knowing what our circumstances and our character demand of us. I know I feel that. I hope all of you do too. That exhilaration at just how tough all of this is going to be, but how necessary it is. One more thing about Joe Dos Passos. When he wrote the words that I quoted in early 1941, you have to picture the circumstances to fully appreciate them, the context, as we historians say. Adolf Hitler's formidable war machine controlled all of continental Europe. Only the British Isles held out, though who knew for how long, dangling by a thread. Dos Passos could have been forgiven for thinking that this terrifying moment, when it seemed possible that the light of liberty would be extinguished in the world, that this was a moment without any historical precedent. But he didn't do that. Instead, he invoked the past and the idea of a historical consciousness that could, and I quote again, stretch like a lifeline across the scary present and help us to gain strength from the knowledge that we remain connected to those who came before us. To do that, we first have to learn or relearn their story, and make it our own. As we do so, we'll discover that we also are learning about ourselves and about all the things of which ordinary people are capable, even us, when we're allowed to breathe the fresh air of freedom and hope. That is what America is all about. And we are not going to let that die, not without a big fight. And thank you all.
Dr. McClay, we have some questions that have been submitted by our audience, so if you'll just stay standing at the podium, I'll ask you a few of these questions.
Okay.
Okay, we have time for just a few. How can you convince young people, particularly Gen Z, that American democracy is still functioning, and how can you inspire them to become more democratically engaged?
You started off with the easy questions. Yeah, I mean, look, it's very hard. It's very hard. In some ways, it's made harder by the fact that they've grown up in such prosperity and ease that they have a sense that this is sort of the natural condition of human beings, that we all, except for, the marginalized groups, or sort of officially certified, registered marginalized groups, which deserve our compassion, pity, and maybe guilt feelings as well. But it's in some ways we have not asked enough of them by way of struggling to find their own way, and that's one of the perils of prosperity. But no, there's something more. I think you need to know something about the rest of the world to really appreciate this country. You need to know, for example, we've had this fight, and those of us at Hillsdale are very involved in this, with the 1619 project you may have heard of the New York Times. I almost feel as if I shouldn't even mention it. Maybe it will go away if I don't mention it, but it won't go away. And that makes the argument that the sort of the foundational fact of American history is slavery. And it's really a kind of silly polemical argument that doesn't have any historical basis. And the historians all agree about that, by the way. But it is a way of tarnishing what 1776, which is the real founding, accomplished. Because 1776 was the first nation on earth to be founded on the principle that all men are created equal, that we all have natural rights that come with our existence through nature, through God. The Declaration kind of blurs that distinction artfully and usefully, I think. That they cannot be granted, they cannot be taken away by government. You can't even give unalienable rights away. They are part of you. They are part of your nature. We are a nation that was founded for the first time in human history on that principle. 1619 and what it represented, the institution of slavery and what it represented in our national history, was a carryover from the brutality of most of human history, against the backdrop of which America shines like a beacon. So I've often thought, just to shift gears a little bit, that you should begin an American history course by having students read The Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, or something about the conditions of a totalitarian socialist society, and then get a sense of what it means to be free, to have that sense of contrast. That's, by the way, Churchill and others have talked about how the young are always more liberal and the older are always more conservative. Well, that's because we know more when we're older. It's not because it's just some sort of flip-flop that you can't jump as high so you become conservative or whatever. No, it is because we know more. We know more about the range of human possibility, including human depravity. We know about the way that power, when it's concentrated, can be abused. Not only have we read about it, we've seen it. We're seeing it right now. I have to say the left it's left, what I've been hearing all my life from the left about the FBI is starting to sound true. So I don't want to get into contemporary affairs, but it's very hard, and in a way, this one doesn't answer the question, but it intensifies the problem. It's very easy to be critical of America when the only standard against which you have to compare us is one of abstract perfection. So I would do, I know it's not your question, somebody out there has this question, ask, where is it better? I remember lecturing at a class about the wonderful marriage of John Adams and Abigail Adams, and said, yeah, but she couldn't legally own property, and I stifled the desire to tell him how lazy he was to just sort of parrot this line without wanting to learn anything more about what she did do, how she managed the farm, managed everything. All the times John was away gallivanting around Europe doing diplomacy, the constitutional, But what you say is where was it better? Where was it better for women at that time? And of course, that requires you to know something to be able to answer it. So don't let them get away with comparing America to a standard of abstract perfection, because we always lose. If everybody in this room, if they're compared to Jesus, is going to fall short. But that's not a fair comparison. It is maybe in certain contexts, but not here. So that's what I'd say. I need to shut up and let another question get in.
Let's try to get in one or two more. Beyond the Hillsdale Barney Charter School Initiative, what is changing in the teaching of U.S. history that can give us hope that positive change is on its way?
Oh, that's a nice big watermelon I can make a mess with. No, the Barney schools are great. Of course, they're the best, and I need to say more about that? But and Hillsdale's really entered in a very big way to the K-12 education. It's a very bold, I think, commendable. It's one of the reasons I came to Hillsdale a year ago and joined their faculty, because I believe that you're not going to reform this by starting at the college level. It's already too late with most college students. We need to reform K through 12. So there are charter schools, and our curriculum that's in the process of being devised and written, it'll be available pretty soon in its entirety. There are other charter school networks, Great Hearts Academy. I have the highest regard for them. They operate out of Phoenix. There's another one called Basis. They're sprouting up all the time. And also there are curricula. We are doing a curriculum. There are a couple of others out there in process or being developed, so that people, I'm thinking particularly of homeschoolers, will have places they can go, and of course they can use Land of Hope, which has a great epigraph that you should read. They can use that, and we have a study guide and teacher's guide to go with that for homeschoolers, but also independent schools and charter schools, classical Christian schools. There's so much going on, and fortunately, curriculum design is lagging a little behind, but not much. And so I think the materials are out there. People are mobilized to make a difference about this. And of course, I mentioned the school boards. It's very gratifying to see what's happening in what just happened in Florida, when the Loudoun County, the Battle of Loudoun County. The parents are rising up against highly politicized and egregious curricula in their schools. And so in every state, you're seeing battles going on. I urge you to get involved. And this is something where the American federalism is a great advantage, although it can be a little burdensome. We have to fight 50 fights because there are 50 states. And some states, like California, I mean, you know, all you can do there is a kind of rearguard action to and keep alive the possibility of charters. Charters are, not everybody's a big fan of charters because they are still public, and there's a sense that the chain can be pulled at some point. But I think they're a good way of translating public expenditures that go almost entirely for bad purposes to go for good purposes as well, which is a nice change. So I think support these kinds of things, be aware of them in your states, and do what you can. And localities, too. I mean, there are battles in individual counties and even townships, municipalities. So I think there's a lot of hope there. Public education was dealt such a blow by COVID and the COVID restrictions. And I don't see it recovering from that. You know, public school enrollments are way down, precipitously down, so that even though the teachers' unions control the Democratic Party, there's not much they can do when the population being served just drops year after year after year. So it's not for me to say you shouldn't send your kids to public school or your grandchildren, but you know, it's a thought.
Thank you, Dr. McClay, very much for being with us this morning.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you.